Wow, Pete Zanardi. I think I read Pete Zanardi stories when I was a little boy. Before I get into the prepared part of this speech, I just want to cast a little light on a great friend of many years. We all have these positives, and then we have these little negative nuances that we all have them, and they can drive you crazy. Well, before I prepared the speech, I said, what is there about Peter that could really drive you crazy? And I came up with one word: cigarettes. Any of you out here who were smokers, and I was for quite a few years, knew that when Peter approached you, one of the first words were, have you got a smoke? Peter smoked more of other people's cigarettes than his own along the way. But here's what I really want to say about Pete Zanardi. Loyalty, literary prowess, and a legacy that will last for a long time in New England racing circles can all be nicely packaged together when you're talking about the over 4-decade writing career of Peter Zanardi. Anyone who's had the time to spend with Peter knows that he's loyal to the letter. Perhaps that has something to do with his generation. His grandparents immigrated here from Italy, and staying close together was an imperative part of how people of that time lived their lives. Veteran sports writer and colleague Charlie Mitchell had this to say about Peter. Once he's your friend forever, Mitchell said. The two have known each other ever since the late 1960s, when Zanardi was covering racing for the Hartford, Connecticut Times, then the paper with the largest circulation among Connecticut dailies, and Mitchell was working for the Norwalk, Connecticut Hour. Peter presented racing in print in such a way that it couldn't help but influence other writers, Mitchell said. I went to my sports editor at the time and told him if a paper the size of the Hartford Times could cover the sport, we should too. In that way, Peter helped me in launching my career as a motorsports journalist. Zanardi's writing in the Times came during modified stock car racing's golden era. When you read one of his stories in either the Times or a little later in Stock Car magazine, he brought the racers of that era to life. You got to know more about Ed Flemke Sr., Bugsy Stevens, Ron Bouchard, Richie Evans, or Bill Slater than just who they were as drivers. Most everybody else gave you the black and white version of those guys, said Mark Bones Bercier, who at the time was a teenager but a person who had the yearning to become a writer. Peter put them into Technicolor. Bercier relates that he will never forget an April 1974 Stock Car Racing magazine story Peter wrote about Evans. I found it cool because I learned that writers could actually hang out with the drivers, Bercier said. Pete Zanardi was able to bring me that close. He opened his piece in Coal Yard Charlie's, a bar that Richie lived above in Rome, New York. The images were so vivid that you could actually smell the cigarette smoke. It made me want to be a writer. From the Hartford Times, Pete Zanardi moved on to the New Haven, Connecticut Register, where he worked from 1976 through 1980. He also turned his attention to Val Lasser's speedway scene and continued doing work for Stock Car Racing and Circle Track magazine. When Dean Nardi and Bones Bercier came up with the concept of what would become Trackside magazine in 1980, Zanardi became the guy who they went to. Through his efforts and superlative writing, Trackside magazine became a premier publication before it ceased operation in 2002. There are other sides to Pete Zanardi. In the early 1970s, he became an integral member of the Stafford Motor Speedway's Public Relations Department. Peter returned to Stafford in 1990 when Mark Arute took over the operations at the track. I was a young intern working at Stafford when I first met Peter, said present Hartford Courant sports writer Sean Cushane. At the time, I didn't know much about racing, and I never thought I would be covering it for any length of time. But Peter put the bug in me. Being around him made me realize how cool the sport was. When the management team at the Waterford, Connecticut Speed Bowl, led by Terry Eames, when looking for a person to take over the track's public relations department, they looked no farther than Chester, Connecticut. Pete Zanardi became the perfect fit. After all, he grew up at the track. Although he slowed down some, Mr. Z is still the PR boss at Waterford, where he's loved by all of the competitors, young and old. When I'd see Peter coming into the pits, and I'd see that smile, said longtime competitor Jerry Pearl, the track's 1993 champion. Peter was always good for a story and sometimes an off-color joke. I knew that it was going to be a good night once I had a chance to talk with Peter. Peter's virtues, however, stretch out past racing. I have had a few personal crises over the years, and he's always been there to lend a listening ear. He's been a devoted husband to his wife, Jane, a great father for his son, Mark, and his daughter, Lynn, and now your typical doting grandfather. Peter's work with his church and other charity groups, along with his political leadership that he's shown in Chester, needs to be credited as well. Writing awards over the years have been numerous. His writing talents have gone out beyond racing to baseball and soccer, two of his other favorite sports. I'm expecting Peter to downplay this award today because that's his typical nature, but it is really my distinct pleasure to present Mr. Peter Zanardi for induction into the 2008 New England Auto Racers Hall of Fame.
Golly, I really never knew I was that good. I want to congratulate all the other inductees, every one of which has achieved something driving or building race cars. I can't remember as much as backing one off a trailer. And when it comes to working on them, ask Bill Slater what I could do with a wrench. I had a lot to do with Bill retiring as a driver. So I'm here today on top of a mountain, forced to acknowledge the culmination of just some tremendous good fortune. How fortunate is it that I can celebrate this greatest moment, maybe the greatest moment in my professional life, with my wife Jane, my children Mark and Lynn, my brother Jimmy, and just a whole lot of good friends. And how fortunate was it that I got out of college looking for a job. I wanted to be a political writer. The only position open was in a sports department. And then how fortunate was it that you go to the Hartford Times and you meet a sports editor that wanted auto racing covered the same way we covered football and basketball and baseball and soccer. He demanded that. How fortunate is it that you get this job and there are people running around like Wimbo and Charlene and Gahan and Harmon and Narduzzi and Burgeon and Stevens and Flemke, Cleary, Zimmerman, Miller. I mean, how fortunate is that? Just a bunch of great stories looking for a media outlet. I pray that I justified the faith those guys showed in me, because it certainly changed my life. How fortunate is it that you get to share a profession with people like Charlie Mitchell and Pete Vanderveer and Walt Renner and Lou Modestino. Despite all that fortune, I tend to wander off in the weeds a whole lot of times. So there were people out there, people like Mark and Jack Rutt, people like Bonesy and Terry Eames and Val Lasur and now Jerry Robinson, that rescued me. I mean, that's just plain fortune, you know, like, and R.A. Sylvia, my God, do we realize what that man does for us, all of us, in collecting our history? He's been collecting it for so long. How good he is to every single media guy in New England. And Bill Slater. The first story I wrote at the Hartford Times was about Bill Slater. I woke him up. He was working at Pratt Whitney in the evening, in the night shift. I woke him up. And after a few mumbles, which he still does, by the way, after a few mumbles, I did the story, and it began a relationship that continues to be just so very, very important to me. Bill, joining you in this august group is indeed very, very special. Danny Pardee. I mean, I mean, that was like the greatest fortune ever, knowing Danny. And I miss him terribly. I miss his wit, and I miss his knowledge, and I miss his advice. And it would be at this point that Danny would say to me, "Hey, Paisan, that's enough. You've made your point. Sit down." Well, I'm going to take Danny's advice. Thank you, everybody, for being part of this very special day.
Ladies and gentlemen, on the cell phone right now, to give his congratulations to Pete Zanardi, is Chrissy Conamacki. Pete?
Thank you very much, Chris. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Well, thank you. I appreciate that, Chris. Thank you. I appreciate that. Okay, Chris. My brother will be glad to hear that.
You will repeat everything that's being said.
I will, Chris. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Pete Zanardi.